Hey, No I listeners. Today I want to talk about a book I read earlier this summer, That Hideous Strength. It's been out for a long time. It's by C.S. Lewis, but it is so relevant for today. And the reason I wanted to discuss it today is because just recently on Point of View Radio Talk Show, we were discussing on the Roundtable an article that came out recently in the Front Porch Republic. Of course, I'll link it. And it's called Memento Vivere by Elizabeth Stice. And I know that my Latin isn't exactly being pronounced correct there, but what it means is remember to live, because people are probably more familiar with the phrase memento mori, remember you must die. And what the author is arguing in this article is that in our day and age, what might be something that we need to remind ourselves of alongside memento mori is memento vivere, remember to live. And of course, this has to do with a lot of the ways that we are existing in digital spaces, in virtual realities, even if we're not necessarily wearing a VR headset. We spend so much of our time online in a virtual space instead of a real physical space. And at the same time, we are very impressed by the abilities of these new machines and technologies that we have, like artificial intelligence. And she says something really insightful here that I think we should consider. My dog wants to be a part of the podcast today. So if you hear him, or if you're watching, see his face pop up in the corner there, apologies, or you're welcome in case you'd like to see a little dog pop in every now and then. Not that he's little, but anyway, here's what she said. She said, and this is relevant because of how well AI is, I think, deceiving people, but really, I guess, just convincing people or winning them over. And she uses the example of a commercial from Anthropic, where basically at the end, it asks if AI could help people be more human. And that is just a lot of the arguments that I hear from AI optimists. And she says, basically is questioning why that is even something that is attractive to us. Why are people convinced that we need digital tools in order to make our lives better? And so many people's lives have already become so integrated with these technologies, whether through chatbot type relationships or just depending on it as kind of a mental aid or resource. And here's what she says. If we cannot tell the difference between ourselves and machines, it may not be that the machines are that good. It may be that our lives are that bad. If a machine is better at caring than we are bad at caring. If robots can cure our loneliness, we have more problems than loneliness. If we think AI will improve aspects of our humanity, we do not understand humanity very well. In this context, memento mori is not useless, but it would be more useful to bring memento vivere into the conversation. I think that's so insightful. And by the way, on the No I podcast, we have talked about robot pets for the loneliness called The Familiar. Is a product that they're developing. We've talked about the AI necklace Friend. Again, AI companions or devices that are made for people in order to stave off loneliness. We've talked about robot teachers. We've talked about all these things that tech developers are kind of pushing or advertising for people to try to help these different aspects of life that the author was just describing. In fact, there was an ad that just came out from another company I hadn't heard of before called Orchid, not the fertility company Orchid, but this company where it's another AI agent or assistant. And the whole commercial is all about a guy who forgot that it was his wife's anniversary. And she asks the AI agent to help him remember and plan the anniversary date. And then the AI agent does remind him, and then he ends up asking the AI agent to help him plan the date, not realizing that the wife had already asked it. So the agent, the AI, is helping both of them, and then they end up having a date at the end of the day. And neither of them actually invested any sort of real emotional connection with each other in order to have a conversation about that or plan their anniversary. And this is a commercial for the product. This is an ad to say, look at how helpful this can be. And it's been dunked on by a lot of people because I think a lot of people do realize how dark and sad that is. So where does this book come in? That Hideous Strength. Let me try to explain it. I'm going to try to convince you to read it, but I also will tell you that there are some spoilers, none of the like details, but I'm going to be talking about some character arcs of the main character and things like that. So if you don't want to know anything about the book and you're planning on reading it, then maybe you want to save this for after you read it. But if I think you will still be interested in reading the book after I talk about it, because I'm not going to give away like huge spoilers. Anyways, when I decided to pick up this book, I had multiple people, including Doug Smith, who has been on the podcast and who I mentioned in the last episode as well, tell me that it is a book for our times, that it was about artificial intelligence, and it's part of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, which I'd always heard about, but never actually read. I love C.S. Lewis. I've talked about his other books, especially The Abolition of Man, on the Know I podcast before. And so I had always been like, yeah, I need to read the Space Trilogy someday, but I just never had. And so since it kept being recommended kind of in conversations about AI and just this new technological era that we're in, I decided, you know what, I need to read it. And so what was funny is I found out that I actually already had the 2/3 of the trilogy on my bookshelf. I think they were my husband's. But I didn't have the first book. So I went around to a few bookstores just because I wanted to try to buy it from a local bookstore. And it was funny because nobody had that first book. But at one of the local bookstores that I went to, the gentleman there said, you know what? I don't think that you need to read the first two before you read the last book. He said it really makes sense by itself and it's the best one. And I was like, okay. And I had heard a few other people say that. And so then I got the book. I went ahead and just picked up That Hideous Strength, which we did have on our bookshelf. And I was like, fine, I'm going to make the decision, which is abnormal for me, but I'm going to skip over the first two books in the series and just go straight to the end. And I realized that he actually said in the preface that it could be read independently. In fact, he says, this book concludes the trilogy of which Out of the Silent Planet was the first and Paralandra the second, but can be read on its own. So there you go, straight from the horse's mouth, C.S. Lewis himself. So then I really felt okay about just reading it by itself. What I also discovered in the preface, which is probably common knowledge, but again, since I hadn't read the Space Trilogy, I didn't know this. He said that that this tall story about devilry has behind it a serious point, which I have tried to make in my Abolition of Man. So essentially, this is the fictionized version of the message that he's telling in Abolition of Man, which I just had happened to reread as part of my master's program that I'm in the spring semester. So like right before I read this. So it was just perfect. It was perfect timing. I was excited to read that because again, I didn't realize that. And then once I started reading it, of course, it clicked and made so much sense that yes, this basically is everything he talked about in The Abolition of Man, just imagined. And so anyways, that's how I came about to reading this at the beginning of the summer. And so I was expecting, science fiction. I was expecting space age type stuff, since it's called the Space Trilogy. I was expecting stuff about, artificial intelligence, more kind of prescient predictions from C.S. Lewis, which he is so good at really I think having a lot of discernment and wisdom about, where humanity was headed. So here's what I did not expect. And I've actually written about this on my personal blog, but this is what I want to talk about and what I was reminded of when I read the article about Memento Vivere is that Hideous Strength is about technology and artificial intelligence and a lot of like creepy things, interdimensional beings, planets that are actually beings themselves, like all these kind of fantastical elements that I expected going in. They're there, but it was much more of an earthy story than I expected. In fact, a huge theme of the story happens to be marriage. And that was something that I really didn't expect, but it begins and ends the story. And that kind of threw me for a loop at first. And I remember ending the book being like, I am so confused. Why did it end that way? And again, without giving away too many details, it has a very down to earth ending. And again, with the theme of marriage being very important. And I was just like, wait a second. This is a book about sci-fi. This is a book about, you know, dangerous technology and on all of this. So why the disconnect? So what I started doing was I just started journaling my thoughts about it. And that is such a good way. And because I've always done that. And now, of course, in the age of AI, where people have to like state what has been obvious to humans for centuries, there are all these studies showing that actually like writing notes and journaling and taking notes by hand is part of the thinking process. And if you are somebody who has always like processed your thoughts better that way, or actually discovered what you actually think through writing, well, now there's papers to back that up and research to back that up. We know that that's a big way our brains function. So anyway, that's a side note. So I just started journaling and kind of reflecting on it. And here's why I think that the theme of marriage and really those like down to earth, very just human, everyday themes throughout the story are right alongside a lot of this like crazy sci-fi, really creepy stuff, kind of, this science fantasy element is running right alongside like this very ordinary element. And at first that confused me, but I think that it's on purpose. And I think that it actually holds a lot of wisdom for us today. So in that Hideous Strength, there are two main characters, Jane and Mark. They are married. They spend very little time together in the actual book. Their journeys basically take them on different paths, which works out well as a literary device because it brings us into the two inner circles of the like two opposing forces of the whole book. So they kind of get drawn into these different groups. And because of that, and the narrative switching back and forth from kind of, Jane's POV and Mark's POV through a lot of the book, you get to see what's happening in both camps. So it works out that way. But they also are, let's just say, as the book is beginning, marriage ain't going so well. And at first I really felt like Lewis is being hard on Jane. And I looked it up. And at the time, I know that he got married later in life. At the time that he wrote this book, he was not married. And I thought, okay, he's kind of got like some old fashioned notions here that are coming through, maybe a little bit of just like subtle sexism in the way that he's treating Jane, or like thinking about marriage and he himself not being married as he's writing this. And so I just kind of ignored some of those things. The narrative was implying that, and other characters in the book that she encountered were implying to her that she was not being fair towards her husband. She didn't have the right kind of attitude toward her husband, Mark, even though he clearly had several issues of his own. And I'm like, why are we focusing on this? Like, leave her alone. Like this, she's married to a loser. And like, why do we have to have a section of this chapter that's focused on Jane's marriage? Like, why are the characters even talking about this? By the end, though, I actually, again, I was humbled and I realized like, okay, I was wrong. And it all comes down to what I think is the root issue of the whole book, the root issue of our time and all time. Really, if you look at the Christian tradition, the queen of vices is pride. A lot of times pride really is at the root of problems that we have, or our own sins and vices. And maybe they kind of initially look like other sins or other vices, but it really does at the end of the day come down to pride. So Jane realizes over the course of the story that she was so in love with the idea of her own freedom and unattachment to anything else that it was preventing her from fully giving herself over to actually loving her family, meaning Mark and any potential family that she would have with him. And at the root, that is self-worship. That is idolization of self. That's idolization of one's own freedom over the sacrificial love that we are called to emulate, that Christ emulated. Mark has his own journey. So at first I was like, why is Lewis being so hard on Jane in this narrative? But Mark gets his comeuppance, and it's well-deserved by the end and satisfying. But what he realizes slowly and stubbornly is that he failed to love well as well. He realizes that basically throughout his whole life, all of his relationships for him became a means to an end, a means to try to be in the inner circle. And again, this is like you see this develop, but it's very clear about Mark from the very beginning that this is his character flaw, is that he wants to be in the inner circle and on the inside crowd and kind of seek that clout and that status more than anything else. And so he realizes eventually that he's even treated Jane that way. And there is a part of him that did, I think, love Jane purely from the beginning, but he realizes that so much of his attitude toward his own wife has actually been about himself and how she will elevate his status, and how basically by being married to her, it all comes back around to being self-serving, which is true for so many of us. Because if we really look at our motivations, there are some people who actually argue that there is no such thing as selflessness or generosity because everything is actually self-motivated in a way. And I don't agree with that because I believe that, we are called to emulate sacrificial love and our sin nature gets in the way, but God wouldn't call us to something that he wasn't going to help us. So even though if we can't perfectly do that on earth, or it's very difficult for us to do, he does call us to be selfless and to lay down our lives for others. That's a big theme within marriage. And so I don't think that we would be called to that if true, pure generosity and selflessness wasn't attainable for humans. So, but because of sin nature, it is true that a lot of the times what we do that looks generous or loving on the outside, inside, our motivations are, well, I'm going to look really good if I do this, or I'm going to feel good about myself if I do this, or if I do this, maybe then they'll do this for me. Or even if I invest, all of this into this person or this project, then I will reap the benefit and the reward of it. Like there is some selfish motivation behind it. And so Jane loved her own freedom and her own self so much that she was walled off and not willing to fully give herself to sacrificial love. And Mark was so self-focused in terms of the clout that he was chasing that he was using everybody in his life, including his own wife, as a means. At the root of that, for both of them, was self-worship, just expressed in different ways. And what is self-worship? It's pride. It really is like the original sin, thinking that I know better and so I need to act in order to serve me rather than to submit to God. We don't want to admit that God knows better than we do. We don't want to admit that he has a better plan for us than we do. We don't trust him. We have pride. That is why pride is the queen of vices. And Christians used to know that. And I think a lot of times today we forget that. And so marriage throughout the book actually becomes a really appropriate vehicle to zoom in and look at how pride can affect daily, ordinary life and relationships. And then you also have kind of the zoom out and the macro. This is where all the science fiction and everything comes into play, which a lot of it I think that we're seeing kind of play out today in different forms. That is also pride. And that is the point. So one of the things that I noticed is that in the story of the Tower of Babel, which is in the Old Testament, again, pride is at the root. Pride is at the root of that whole story. And, that is why I think, I think a lot of people who have studied this come to the same conclusion that that's why God confused the languages and had to intervene and stop the project. People became so enamored with their own ability that they wanted to build something that could help them achieve godlike status. And it was about pride in their own effort, pride in their own potential, and pride, I think, in their own self-preservation too. There are also thoughts that, this narrative that we see in Genesis happens right after the flood. And so there are some, people who think that with this catastrophic flood in recent memory, you have people groups that then want to try to build a very, very, very tall tower that will stretch to the heavens so that they can save themselves from that again. Well, the reason the flood happened in the first place is because people were not serving the Lord. They were not submitted to God. And so civilization was wiped out. And so once again, they are trying to save themselves, still not learning the lesson. So that's one theory. But even, regardless of the superficial why, there is so much pride throughout that narrative in the way that they are approaching this project. And that is a comparison that a lot of people have used in terms of technological advancement today. You have these, people in the tech industry who are saying that they are inventing God, that they are building God, talking about just, how even catastrophic that this might potentially be for human beings. And there are so many quotes about this. And then it's like, well, why are you building it? And I think a lot of it has to do with just people are enamored with the fact that they can. You could quote Jurassic Park. You were so consumed with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think about whether or not you should. But what's the root of that sin right there that I think we're seeing play out in a lot of ways today? It's pride. It's pride to ultimately worship ourselves and look at how amazing we are as humans and how we can do this. And we don't need the real God. We can either make our own or become our own. So what I really think is that when you dig down, what pride is the undoing of the natural order that God created. And, that includes like the natural order of submission, which nobody likes that word, but us submitting to God and the way that he made us as human beings to function. And then we see even in the example in that hideous strength of Mark and Jane's relationship in marriage of how neither of them are actually loving each other sacrificially. Neither of them are surrendering to the purpose of marriage to fully give themselves over to the other person for reasons of pure selfless love rather than just, personal attainment or self-worship or whatever. So you see that in relationships. And so there are so many examples of where pride is really us rejecting the order that God has established. And that's what happened in the Garden of Eden when Eve decided to rebel against God because she started to doubt something that he said. And instead of being content with everything that he had given and the role that he had given her and Adam as image bearers and caretakers of creation, instead of being satisfied with that, she wanted to be God, her and Adam both. And then, in the Tower of Babel, it's look at how we can build. We can be like God. We can be as high as he is in the heavens. And so there's those big examples of that. But then there are smaller examples too of we think that whether it's in our relationships or even just in the way that we live our lives, that we can somehow work around the order that God has established and we can just do things our own way. And that is pride. And so one of the things that I think is so, again, just very, very prophetic in that hideous strength is how the disdain for natural life that people who are part of NICE, which stands for what did it stand for again? National Institute for, well, I can't remember. Let me look it up. The National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, abbreviated as NICE. So the people who work for this organization have a disdain for natural life, for natural creation, the destruction of like natural habitats and small villages and quaint things is definitely a theme throughout the book. But they even disdain like sexual reproduction. So here's a quote. This is Professor Philostrato, who is a character who is a part of NICE. And this is a quote that he says, and I'll read some modern day comparisons. But he says, "We do not want the world any longer to be preferred over with organic life. We must get rid of it by little and little, of course. Slowly we learn how to make our brains live with less and less body, learn how to reproduce ourselves without copulation." And I think that that's very interesting. And in the book, someone kind of pushes back and it's kind of like, oh, that wouldn't be very fun. And he pushes back again, Professor Philostrato, and is like, hey, we've moved beyond this, right? Now, I don't think we're quite as far today along that path, but just to kind of talk about some of these adult trends for a minute, just FYI, in case you have any kids listening, with online pornography more easily available than it ever has been, and so many people admitting to be, and you see this in polls and surveys and everything, addicted to it, and how people are becoming addicted to more and more drastic and horrific and extreme versions. But anyway, it's all virtual. And in the meantime, you have these dramatic drops in like teen pregnancies or pregnancies out of wedlock, which a lot of people celebrate because we don't necessarily want teen pregnancies and pregnancies out of wedlock. And if the reason was because people were being chased and they were getting married and then having children as adults, then that would be great. But that's not happening because marriage rates are also declining and fertility rates are also declining. It's that people aren't having sex. And in general, in society, when people stop having sex, that's not a good thing. And a lot of it is because people aren't interacting in the real world. They're not even with other people enough to pursue a relationship or to pursue marriage, or they think that they can just get satisfied on their devices by watching pornography. It's very dark. And so even if we don't recognize it as such, and we don't have people saying, hey, we need to stop having sex. I mean, there are some people who say that, meaning period. People accuse Christians of saying that. And by the way, that is not the message of Christianity. Sex is a very good thing. It's just for marriage as God defined it. But the anti-sex message is actually from the world because it destroys and eradicates and twists something that God made good. And it first, I think, eradicates the context in which that thing is supposed to be enjoyed, and then takes the gift away altogether. So anyways, even though we don't have NICE today saying that we need to learn how to reproduce ourselves without copulation, we are trending as a society in that way. Now, this is a real quote from Noor Siddiqui. She is the CEO of Orchid, that is the fertility company that I was talking about, where it is all about basically genetic screening. So you reproduce through IVF. You have this ability to screen all of your embryos and select which ones based on whatever your preferences are. And so it's consumer babies. It's, you create all these embryos and then you choose the best one because we want to optimize. And it's portrayed as this is how we can eradicate diseases. Well, not really eradicate diseases or heal them, just look at the embryo that we've already created and look and see if it has a disease. And if it does, we'll just destroy that one and we won't implant it. So anyways, this is her vision for the future, and her famous quote is, "Sex is for fun, embryo screening is for babies." So we are already in a society moving towards a trend of people trying to normalize that the responsible way to have babies in the future is through IVF so that you can genetically screen your embryos and only choose the best one. It's eugenics. And then you use birth control or whatever if you want to have sex just because you want to do that, but that's not actually how we're going to make babies in the future. There are people who truly believe this and argue this. And then we could talk about, the lab experiments that they're doing to try to, reproduce organisms using human cells and all of that. So there's even more kind of sci-fi versions of this, but this is something that people are working towards to fundamentally unspool the way that families have been created and that the order in which they were meant to be created according to God. Now, this is in terms of the Professor Philostrato quote on learning how to make our brains live with less and less body. That sounds crazy. You'll see examples of that in That Hideous Strength. But, oh, wait, here's Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which is the parent company of ChatGPT. And I've talked about this on the podcast before. He's one of many people who has, I think, put a down payment of $10,000 down to this company called Netcom, which is supposed to digitize your brain at some point in the future, when you choose to die by assisted suicide, they euthanize you because the brain has to be fresh, and then they are digitizing it. They are researching this. And here's what a quote from him: "I assume my brain will be uploaded to the cloud." So this book was written in the 1940s, and yet you can find multiple examples almost on a daily basis of people actually moving in this direction. But again, back to what I think the root issue is here, it's pride. It's saying that the bodies God gave us and the family order that God established and the way of creating new people and interacting in relationships and giving yourself over to selfless love in relationship and in family and in marriage, none of that's good enough. We've got to redo it all. It's I think, an impulse to create and improve that we get from being made in the image of God, twisted by sin. So that instead of using our creative impulse to steward and care for creation and then create within God's natural order, we want to create in such a way that we are destroying God's natural order and his natural creation. I really do think that that is a twist on human creativity, because our creativity is a good thing, but if it is used to twist or subvert or destroy something that God created and called good, then that is not a good use of our creativity, and that's not what it was for. But at the root of it is pride, thinking that we know better or we can create something better. We can create a better family. We can create better human beings. We can create better children. We can create a better world. We don't need nature. We can make our own. Okay, there are so many examples that we see today. So I'm going to bring up Paul Kingsworth again, like I also did in the last episode. This is it. There's so much that this book is about. And like I said, there are parts I agree with, parts I don't, parts that a lot of people are going to think are really weird and strange, and other parts that they probably will agree with. There's just a lot here. But the thing that has stuck with me is that as humans, we have thrown off any acknowledgement of or submission to any authority higher than our own. Again, it's pride. We want to be God. And here's a wonderful quote, I think a very incisive quote that has really stuck with me. And I come back to it so often when I see the direction that we are headed with so much of this quote unquote progress that is before us today. And this is not a new impulse. Again, like look at the examples from the Garden of Eden, the very beginning, from the Tower of Babel, all throughout history. But it's just because I think of the way that we have advanced in terms of technology and the scientific abilities that we have discovered through innovation, I think it's just we're able to be much more open about it now. But anyways, he says, "We seek openly now to become the gods we always wanted to be, using technology as the force which will get us there." It's that pride as the queen of vices, as that ultimate sin offensive to God. I think it's the rejection of his authority. That's what it is. And technology, it just allows us to be a lot more open about it now. To be able to say things like, we don't need God. We can, we can create God, to have this kind of artificial, quote, intelligence that seems omniscient, that seems omnipresent, that a lot of people are turning to, like the oracle that is going to give them wisdom or know everything or surpass human knowledge. I think it's pride, it's hubris, and thinking that we don't need God anymore because we've outgrown it. We've outgrown him. And that's pride is at the root of it. What's ironic and what Lewis portrays so well in using his imagination and engaging our imagination in that hideous strength is showing us how when we allow pride to win and we become dedicated to our own supposed freedom, separate from God and God's created order, what we actually do is we end up being trapped in hells of our own making. And there are parts of that hideous strength that are very hellish. And it's easy to see when it's in kind of a fictionized form like that. But then again, look around, look at people who are depressed, look at people who are anxious, look at people who are addicted to their devices, the way that, children's development and ability to enjoy the pleasures again of natural life because their dopamine receptors in their brain have been so exploited and manipulated that they can't enjoy natural life, and they have to literally retrain their brain to be able to enjoy basic things. Like, this is not freedom. This is not a good life. This is hell. And I'm not saying that in a literal sense because I do believe in a real hell, but I mean, what is hell? It's separation from God. And so if we think that we can have a better life by inventing our own outside of what God has given us and created for us, then yeah, that we're going to end up in hell metaphorically in this life and literally in the next. So I think, again, this isn't technology's fault, but certain kinds of technology, I think, can tickle our prideful sense and trick us and deceive us into, again, thinking like being enamored with our own ability and thinking that we can create our own existence and our own rules for existence outside of what God has created. And I just think it doesn't end very well. It doesn't end very well for human beings. This is something that I wrote before, that the technologies we've developed in the name of progress are actually causing or contributing to our regress, pulling us away from the things that make us human. And there's another great character in that Hideous Strength. His last name is Frost, which is a great and appropriate name for him. He is so enamored by this supposed progress and how, this technology that they've discovered and this power that they've tapped into, he's unable to see how inhuman he's actually become. And that's one of the creepiest parts of the book. But anyways, and I think, like, again, with that ad about using an AI agent to interface between you and your spouse because one of you forgot your anniversary and never actually acknowledging that between you. And then at the end of the day, you get to go out to a nice restaurant. Like, do we not realize how inhuman that is? How violating that is of everything that we're supposed to be and enjoy and invest in as human beings, like relationship with other human beings. You're letting AI replace that. That is so inhuman. That is regressive. That is isolating you. That is trapping you in a hell of your own making rather than what God created, which can be difficult, but is so much more worth it and fulfilling and satisfying, which is pressing into what is actually real and good, including in relationships. So anyways, I do want to wrap it up by talking about the marriage theme again, because then the book kind of ends here. And once I started reflecting on this and viewing it through the lens of pride, then I really think that was an intentional choice by Lewis to make a marriage kind of the down to earth example of pride, and how destructive it is at kind of that micro, that intimate level, even as so much of the plot of the book is about pride at the bigger macro level of, like, we're going to completely change human existence and, the natural world and all of that and all of these creepy and scientific and fantastical and technological things. There's kind of that bigger example of pride, but then there's the little example of pride too. And that's what we see in the marriage and how destructive that is to a relationship. But relationships are what make us the most human. God said in the Bible, we see this, the two most important things: love God and love other people. So if we aren't doing that, then we are not living as whole human beings. So if our relationship with God is broken and can only be restored through Jesus Christ. And so if we don't take advantage of that restoration and we don't lay down our pride and realize that we need God and that we need to live within the order that He has created in submission to Him in order to actually thrive and be free, then we're not living as fully human as we were created to be. And if our relationship with other human beings is broken, then same thing. Like, we have to have both of those aspects if we want to be fully human and free and thriving in the way that God created. So, I mean, literally, when marriage breaks down, you see society as a whole break down. Like when marriages break down, kids struggle, they fail, they don't succeed, you have more poverty, then it's just like it's the fundamental institution that God created of any human society. And so again, like research, this isn't a religious opinion. There's research bears this out, that when you don't have healthy marriages and healthy nuclear families in a society, then you don't have a healthy society. But when you have strong marriages, you have stronger kids, you have stronger societies. And so that's very important in a literal sense. But I also think that in the book, the focus on marriage works symbolically as an example of the most intimate human relationship that we have on earth. In that way, it's very earthy, as I keep saying. And there's this other great scene in the book where, early on, you can see that Mark's sensibility to recognize the beauty of the natural world is not completely destroyed. And one of his colleagues is, because he's noticing like the beautiful day and the birds singing and this dusty old pub where friends are sitting around and they're drinking a pint of beer together and talking. And he's kind of like getting in a good mood. And he's like, this is nice. Like, this is beautiful. And ironically, it's a town that they're there to destroy. And his colleague is like, now we got to get rid of all of this. And of course, it's much more eloquently and thoughtfully presented in the book. It's very poignant. But I think that's like, even though it kind of comes at the beginning of the book, that's one of the most important scenes. And it actually ties into then the theme of marriage at the beginning and the end, because I think this is going to, I'm trying to bring it home here. What I'm trying to say is that one of the ways, I think one of the most important ways to rebel against our rebellion of God's natural order, which he created, which is good, is to actually enjoy and lean into and hold on to the gifts that he's given us in that natural order. Relationships with other people, enjoying the beauty of creation that he's given us. Like, there are so many things, and this is part of what we talked about on Point of View the other day, Memento Vivere. Like, there are so many things in life that don't have to be enjoyable. Like, there's no reason that we have to be able to enjoy the taste of fruit, but it's just there. Like, you could have a functional world that has all the elements necessary for survival that's not as just extravagantly beautiful and wonderful as our world is. There is so much in our world that is created for us to enjoy. Like, you can survive in a family and operate with like, just the basics of somebody's hunting down the food and somebody else is, preparing it. But like, it's good. There's laughter. There's pleasure in relationship. Those things are not incidental. I think they're fundamental to being human, and they are examples of enjoying the created order that we're supposed to live within. And if we lose sight of that, then it's like, well, why not just focus on efficiency and optimization and making things as perfectly as we can, because we can. And look at this, wonderfully efficient and well operating world that we've created that is so much more practical than the natural world that existed before. Like the Philostrato in the book, all that our organic life. Like, we don't need that. And yes, we do. And so the Memento Vivere, I think, ties in very well with kind of the point of like the counterpoint to pride is, yes, we submit to God's order, but it's enjoyable. And there is life, and there is love, and there is enjoyment. And whenever we allow ourselves to enjoy those things, little as they may seem, the little quirky relationships that you have with people, or even the annoyances that you can have in a relationship with a longtime friend or your spouse or a sibling or whatever. The quirkiness of a small town and a small business, that it's like, could you get rid of it and build something that was much more efficient? Yeah, but that's not always the answer. I think this is a really good book. I think you should read it. I think you should read the article I'll link about remembering to live. And in an age where I think our pride as a human race is on display more prominently than it has been, I think, for us in a very, very long time. It's more evident because of the abilities that we have in the modern age. Then I really think one of the most important things we can do is to just be as fully human as possible and resist that pride and say, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. But I'm going to submit, not just theoretically, to God's created order by like having some philosophical stance against, a certain kind or iteration of technology, but I'm going to submit to that every day in laying down my pride and fully investing in my human relationships and not thinking that I am above all the wonderful, you know, pleasures and joys and things that God has created in the world. I think that's one of the most important things we can do. And I think it's one of the most important things that people need right now. And if they're going to wake up to realize that technology isn't the answer to every problem and it's not actually going to make them happy, they have to see examples of other people actually living joyful, flourishing lives in the real world and see a contrast. So let's be that contrast. But that's it for today. I'll see you next time on the Know I Podcast.